Welcome to Blender Frenzy. I am Justin, and if you are an absolute beginner in Blender, this is the video for you. I'm going to give you a very quick crash course into Blender and how to move around 3D space and manipulate 3D objects. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, just really quick, down and dirty jump start so you can get started right now. So having said that, if you have a fresh install of Blender, go ahead and fire it up and you should see something that looks like this with this nice little splash screen here. Now I'm using version 2.82a, which at the time of this recording is the current version. And basically this is just an initial setup of the settings of Blender. You can play around with the settings on your own. I'm going to point out two of them. The first one is the select with the left or the right mouse button. This is how you select your objects by default. Now, some people like right select. I like left select. So the next one here is the load 2.81 settings. If you have a previous version of Blender, usually it recognizes that and you can click this to load in those settings. I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to click out of it. And you can actually find all of these same options if you go to Edit and then Preferences, click key map, and then right here you have select with the left and the right, spacebar action, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now I'm not going to go through all of these preferences. I'll let you experiment with them, but I am going to go up to interface and change the resolution scale from 1 to 1.25. And basically that just blows everything up. You don't have to do this. I'm just doing this for your sake so you can see my screen better. Okay, so I'm going to X out of there. And now we should be in our layout tab up here. This is our layout workspace. And you can see the main area here is our 3D viewport, where we can see our 3D objects and we can navigate around in 3D space. Now 3D space is made up of three axes, the X, the Y, and the Z. And those are your three dimensions, and that's why it's called 3D. Now the green line here represents the Y axis. The red line represents the X axis, and together they make up the ground plane. Now the up and down axis we can't see right now, but we can change that if we come up to our overlays and then check the Z axis. And if we come up here to our outliner real quick and then just hide the cube, you can see where all three axes converge. That is our world origin. You can also see our 3D cursor, which we will talk about in a little bit, but for now I'm going to go ahead and unhide my cube. And to navigate around 3D space, we can use these gizmos here on the side. So if I click and drag this gizmo here, it will rotate the view. And basically, we are just moving an invisible camera called the user camera. And if you can see here, we are in user perspective. That's what we are rotating around. The next button here, this magnifying glass, if I click and drag that, that will zoom in and out. The hand button here will pan the view, moving it back and forth or up and down. The camera button, if I click that, will toggle in and out of camera view. And you can see now I am in camera perspective in camera view. And if I click that button again, I am now in user perspective. And again, the user camera is just this invisible camera that's floating around. And the last button here is orthographic mode. So now you can see I'm in user orthographic, and now there is no perspective. So there is no vanishing points, and all of the lines are parallel. It's basically just a flat 2D image here. And you can see the effect it has on our cube if I toggle back and forth. Here's with perspective and without perspective. Okay, so you can do all of this navigation with shortcuts if you have a 3-button mouse. That's your left mouse button, your right mouse button, and the middle mouse button is your scroll wheel. So you can actually push down on the scroll wheel and use it as a button. So if I push down on the scroll wheel and rotate around, that rotates my 3D view. If I use the scroll wheel to scroll up and down, it zooms in and out of my view. If I press and hold Shift and then press my middle mouse button down, I pan the view, moving it left and right and up and down. And then to go in and out of camera view, I can press 0 on my numpad. Now, if you don't have a 10-key numpad for some reason, maybe you're on a laptop that doesn't have one, no worries. Just come up here to Edit, Preferences, select Input, and then up at the top where it says Keyboard, check Emulate Numpad. And what this does is now if I press the 0 on the top number row, it'll act just like the 0 on the numpad. And that goes for all of the numbers on the top row. It emulates all of the numbers of the numpad. But I have a numpad, so I'm going to change that back. Just come back to Preferences and uncheck Emulate Numpad. And speaking of numpad, you can also use the numbers on the numpad to navigate around. If I press 7, I am now in top orthographic view. You can see that over here. And I am now looking down along the blue Z axis. If I press 1, I am now in front orthographic view. And now I'm looking along the green Y axis. If I press 3, I am now in right orthographic view, and now I'm looking along the red x-axis. Now this is the left side of the cube. If I press and hold my middle mouse button, I can start to drag out of that, and you can see that's the left side. So I don't know why 3 is called right orthographic view, but it is what it is. I can also use 2, 4, 6, and 8, who do we appreciate, to move in increments. So this is pressing 4, moving around this way. I can move the opposite way, pressing 6, 2, and 8, move it up and down. So I'm going to press 7, and then click with my middle mouse and rotate. Numpad 5 will toggle in and out of orthographic view. If for some reason you've lost your place and you're all like crazy, like over here, and you can't get back, one thing you can do is make sure you hover your mouse over the viewport and press home on the keyboard, and then it will center everything in the scene in your viewport. Now this will be different depending on how big your scene is, but for the most part, especially when you get started, this will be helpful for you, and then you can just rotate up and around again. If for some reason you can't get back to where you started like this and you don't need to save anything, then you can always come up here, go to File, New, and then General, and it'll ask you, do you want to save? And if you do, make sure you save. But if you don't, just say don't save, and it will load the factory default settings. Okay, so to select objects in Blender, just press A to select all objects. Now make sure your mouse cursor is hovering over the viewport. In Blender, your mouse cursor position is very, very important. It's always context sensitive. If I hover my mouse over the outliner here and press A, it will select everything over there. So just make sure you know where the position of your mouse cursor is at all times. Okay, so to deselect everything, I can press Alt-A, or I can double A, or I can just click out. Now to select individual objects, you can just left or right mouse click depending on your settings that we set up here with select with left or right. So I have mine with the left, so I'm just going to left click my mouse button on these 3 objects here, and that you can see is selected. You can select multiple objects by shift selecting different objects and adding it to the selection. Now all 3 of these are selected. You can box select by clicking and dragging a box around different objects. Now to do that, make sure you are in box select mode up here, this select box here, select box mode. If you can't see this toolbar, just press the T key on the keyboard and that will toggle that in and out. And then you can drag a box to select around there. Now, just dragging a box and selecting an object and then dragging a box and selecting another object, it will replace that selection. To add to the selection, you can press B and then select, and then that adds to the selection. B adds to the selection. Now I can also circle select. If I press C, you see this little circle that comes up. If I scroll with my mouse wheel, you can change the size of that circle, and anything in the circle will be selected, and I can basically use that just to start painting around different objects. Left mouse button selects, and middle mouse button deselects, and then the right mouse button, if I click that, will exit the tool. Okay, if I just click to select my cube, you can see it's highlighted in this light orange color, and that means that is the active selection. It's the only selection, but it's also the active selection. You can see that represented over here in our properties here, in our Object Properties tab. If you can't see any of these tabs for some reason, your screen isn't big enough or it's down here like this, you can always use your scroll wheel to scroll through these tabs. You can also click down and drag through those tabs, but I'm just going to make sure that all the tabs are shown over here. Make sure you're in your Object Properties tab, and this is your cube. If I select the camera, you can see now the camera is in our properties. Same thing with the light. Now, if I select my cube and shift select my camera now becomes the active selection. These are both selected, but the one I select last is the active selection, and you can see that here in the properties. Now I can change that if I hold shift down and then I select the cube. Both of them are still selected, but now the cube is the active one. Same thing here. If I shift select the light all of these are selected, but now the light is the active selection. Now it's very important to know the difference between active and non-active selections. Now selecting objects in the outliner is a little bit different. So it doesn't matter what mode, left or right select you have, it's always left mouse button select to select an object here. And you can see as I select the object, it's selected here in the viewport. If I select the cube, it's selected here in the viewport. If I want to select multiple objects, I click on one of them and then I control click on another one. And that selects both of those objects, with the last one that I selected, the active selection. Now remember, that's different from the viewport. The viewport, it's shift select. So I select my camera and then I shift select my light to select both of them, with my light being the active selection. If I shift select in the outliner, select my camera and then shift select my light, it selects the range because it's acting like a browser, which essentially that's what it is. So it's going to select anything between camera and light, which right now is only the cube, but now all of those are selected. And if you also notice, the last one that I selected does not become the active selection. It stays on the first selection that I have. So clicking the camera and then shift clicking the light keeps the camera as the active selection. That's different than if I click the camera and then control click the light is now the active selection. So just a few things to keep in mind, a few differences to remember when selecting in the outliner versus selecting in the viewport. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring our Z-axis back here. And to delete objects, all you have to do is click on the object, press X, and then choose delete. You can also press the delete key. To add objects, you can go up to add, mesh, and then cube, and then that brings it back. And object will always be added to wherever this 3D cursor is. Now to move this 3D cursor, if you're in left select mode, you can press shift and then right click, and that will move that 3D cursor around. So if I move it here, I can go up to add and then mesh, and then let's choose UV sphere. Boom. Shift right click over here, and I can also add objects by shift A and then choose an object, in this case, the monkey. If I select the monkey, shift select the UV sphere, and then press X, I can delete those. To get the 3D cursor back into the world origin, you can press Shift S to bring up the snapping pie menu and then choose cursor to world origin. To move and manipulate the cube, click on the cube and come over to your toolbar. Again, if you don't see this, press the T key, T for toolbar. And let's click move. And now we have our move gizmos. Now, there are three ways to move something. You can move it freely, you can constrain it on an axis, or you can exclude an axis. So to move it freely, you can click in the middle where this ring is, this white ring. If I click and drag, I'm moving that freely wherever I want to. Now, as I'm moving it, if I don't let go of my mouse button, I can right click and it will cancel that action. That's actually very common in Blender. If you right click while you're doing an action, it will cancel that. So to constrain it on an axis, of course, just drag it on these little arrows you can see that go along the axes. To exclude an axis, use these squares. So if I don't want it to go up and down, I choose the blue Z-axis square, and then I move my cube. Now I'm only moving it along the ground plane, and I'm not moving it up and down. Just a quick tip, if you're freely moving stuff, it's going to do so according to your current viewport perspective. So be careful with that. So if I set this over here, I may think that I'm setting this on top of the ground plane, but I'm not. If I actually come over here and I pan around and zoom, you can see it's actually set it below that ground plane. So just something to be mindful of. Now you can undo that action by pressing Control Z, and then it will bring it back up to the center there. Okay, so let's look at the rotate tool. It's the same thing. If I click and drag on that white ring, it'll rotate it on all axes according to your current view in the viewport. If I select one of the axes, it'll rotate it just on that. Okay, so the scale tool, it's the same thing. Again, the white ring, if I click and drag, scales it on all axes. If I click on just one of the axes, of course, it'll only scale it on that one. Undo. And then clicking and dragging the squares will exclude that axis. This button here will enable all transform tools at the same time, so you can have access to all of them if you need. So I'm going to undo those. Now that gets a little cluttered, so of course in Blender you can do everything we just did using shortcuts. So I'm going to click our selection box up here, and then to move, all I have to do is press G for grab, and then I'm freely moving this around. To constrain this on one of the axes, after I press G, I can press Y, or X, or Z, and then that will constrain it on that axis. I can also exclude an axis if I press G and then I press Shift Z, then I am excluding that axis. So now I'm just moving it on the X and the Y and not the Z. If I don't want to move it on the X axis, I press Shift X, and now I'm moving it on the Z and the Y. Same thing for the Y. Shift Y, I will exclude the Y axis. Something to note is that some non-American keyboards switch the Y and the Z keys. So if one or the other isn't working for you, try switching them up. To rotate, all I have to do is press R, and that rotates it. X to rotate it on the X, Y, or Z. And then press S to scale. S and then Y scales it on the Y, or the X, or the Z. S to scale, and then Shift Z to exclude that axis. So that was a quick introduction on how to navigate 3D space and manipulate 3D objects. Stay tuned for next time, where we will talk about the difference between an object and a mesh, and then change the shape of our mesh in edit mode.